Now, you've probably been following, if you've been following this channel, you've been following channels like mine. We've been talking about Taiwan and the risk of war. And we've had a flurry of pontifications about Taiwan. And the reason for this is, one, because the Ukraine conflict is not going in NATO's favor, and there is a dual agenda here. There is a two-front war that the United States wants to wage, and it wants to wage it against Russia and China. And China principally being the most important target, because China is the quote-unquote strategic competitor of the highest threat, right? It is considered the biggest threat. Russia, of course, is really important as well, but China is the biggest threat. And so we've had Mike Minahan, right, top Air Force commander, say that, oh, well, China 2025, that will be the year that the war will happen. And we need to prepare for this. And there was a leaked memo saying that all those involved in the Air Force need to mobilize to prepare for this. You had Michael McCall recently on Meet the Press saying the United States' Congress needs to vote on a war resolution to engage with China as soon as possible. You've had Foreign Policy Magazine talk about all the different ways that this war could be fought, from a tech war, from a military front, from an economic war, from a political, propagandistic war, a propaganda war. We've had over and over again, you've had James Bierman, the top general in Japan, talk about how Asia is really just a theater of war to confront China. Over and over and over again, it has been confirmed that the U.S. seeks war with China, and Taiwan is the principal target. And why is that? Because it's the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and it's also economically important to the United States, given that a huge part of this war on China is a tech war, and Taiwan is the home of the semiconductor industry, these chips that make the highest level of technology work. So Taiwan is always on the agenda. You had President Tsai Ing-wen of the Taiwan Authority visit the United States to see Kevin McCarthy earlier this month, earlier in April, and she once again crossed China's red line by operating as a so-called independent official, an official that representing a national body. That is a violation of the One China principle. And whether she said she was doing that or not, that's what China interpreted as, just like August 2022, when Tsai Ing-wen met with Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan. These red lines are constantly being crossed, and the threat of war is becoming more and more real. So not only this, but you have a lot of separatist elements in Taiwan's authority. And you had recently the former president of Taiwan's authority of the KMT visit China, and it was very symbolic, but it was also very real in the sense that he visited China, mainland China, in order to assert that peace must be a priority and the One China principle must be reaffirmed. Now, that was at the same time that Tsai Ing-wen was in the United States doing the exact opposite, saber rattling with China. But we all know in November 2022, Tsai Ing-wen was struck a huge defeat in the DPP, the ruling party in Taiwan's authority, was struck a huge defeat in the November local elections by losing 80+% of the seats. And she had to resign as the head of the party, and she will likely lose in 2024. But nonetheless, they're still talking about these separatist elements are still talking about conflict with China. No matter how weak their position becomes, they're still talking about it. The so-called top diplomat, and mind you, this is not an independent governing authority. It really is a province of China that has semi-autonomy, meaning it has a one country, two systems model. But Joseph Wu told the media that Beijing may be planning a military offensive in 2027. So he is trying to say that China is the one that is planning the offensive. And this so-called foreign minister, Joseph Wu, has claimed this on UK's LBC radio station, saying we are taking China's military threat very seriously, And I think 2027 is the year we need to be serious about. And as you can see, they're just throwing dates out there now. 2025, Mike Minahan said 2027 now. It's just throwing these dates out there, hoping one of them may stick, although they shouldn't really be hoping this because that's the end of Joseph Wu. That's the end of life itself if this war were to actually happen. So Reuters revealed last month that the British government had approved a considerable increase in exports of submarine parts and technology to Taiwan in 2022. It followed a call by Prime Minister Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, she didn't last very long, for a global NATO to arm Taipei in the same way the alliance was arming Kiev. Wu's assessment of China-Taiwan relations echoes outlined by CIA Director William Burns last February, where he appeared on Face the Nation and said President Xi has instructed the PLA and the Chinese leadership to be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan, and that Beijing had decided to invade in 2027 or any other year. So again, not coherent. This is the CIA director, but Joseph Wu is essentially just mimicking what the CIA director had to say. And this is how pathetic the Taiwan authorities' separatist elements really are. So a month prior to Burns' comments, you had NBC citing an internal memo from Mike Minahan, as I said, the head of the Air Mobility Command, in which he told his staff fighting over the island could break out within 2 years. However, while an AMC spokesperson confirmed the authenticity of the memo, an anonymous Pentagon official told the outlet that these comments are not representative of the department's view on China. On Friday, China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang warned that those who play with fire on the question of Taiwan will get burned, and that Beijing will never back down in the face of any act that undermines China's sovereignty and security. And so, you have some training, combat, you have the military drills, and this is just going to go over what China thinks about Taiwan. It considers Taiwan a province. It considers Taiwan an inseparable part of China, and that reunification is the aim. Peaceful reunification is the aim. And that the One China principle essentially stipulates through the United Nations, it is a UN resolution 2758. You also have the One China principle basically being adopted by 90+% of countries in the world, including the United States, with 3 joint communiques itself. So the One China principle is essentially law, but the United States is using Taiwan's pliable, malleable authority, its puppet servants, to break it. And the problem with this, though, right? And there's a major problem with this. All of this war talk, there's a big problem. And that problem is that there's no shot in HELL, there's no shot down under that the United States can win such a war. And the reason for this is not because the United States doesn't have the military to do so. It's because there are already war games revealing that the U.S. is a key witness, and that weakness is surprise, surprise. Does this sound familiar? Washington would be unable to resupply the island with weapons in the event of a Chinese invasion. So the Center for New American Security has been simulating war games with China over Taiwan so many times it's hard to count. But they've come up with these reports. It's a military-industrial complex think tank, State Department-funded think tank that has been coming out with these reports about how a war would go with China. And here is the latest. So the U.S. House Committee on China has participated in one with the Center for New American Security. Meet the Press did another one earlier last year. In this war game, modeled an exercise ordered by this House Committee, which shows that it would be impossible for Washington to resupply Taiwan with weapons and equipment after a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The exercise was carried out this week by the U.S. Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party with help from the Center for New American Security in Washington. We are well within the window of a maximum danger for a Chinese Communist Party invasion, and yesterday's war game stressed the need to take action to deter the CCP's aggression and arm Taiwan before the crisis begins, says U.S. Representative Mike Gallagher, a Wisconsin Republican who chairs the committee. The exercise showed that U.S. forces would suffer heavy losses if the Pentagon doesn't shore up its stockpiles of long-range missiles and negotiate use of more military bases in the Asia-Pacific region. Reuters reported, citing an unidentified person familiar with the modeling results. The conflict would leave the world's financial markets in absolute tatters. The business community is now taking the threat of Taiwan crisis seriously enough, is not taking the threat of Taiwan's crisis seriously enough, Gallagher said, warning that a lax attitude on the issue verges on dereliction of fiduciary duty. So essentially, what this war game simulation said is the global economy would be destroyed. China is the most important economy in the world. Taiwan is the home of all the semiconductors. Put two and two together, and you have a global economy. Supply chains absolutely severed. If you thought Russia was bad with the sanctions on Russian energy and basically everything else, just wait until that happens with China through serious conflict. But also, this is what's important: shoring up its stockpiles. And what lesson have we learned from Ukraine? Is that the United States can't shore up its stockpiles because it's used them all. How can it shore up its stockpiles? It'll take years, and that's what they have admitted. That's what the Pentagon and defense officials and the Biden administration admit. It's going to take years to get them back to the levels that they need to be, and then you got to produce more, because guess what? The conflict in Ukraine isn't even over. So this really is a money grab for the military-industrial complex, because what CNAC is saying is that you need to give more money to the military-industrial complex so they can build the production lines to fortify Taiwan. Now, there's already a backlog of tens of billions of dollars, US dollars, of US armaments that have not yet been shipped to Taiwan. And that backlog is due to supply issues, and it's also due to just incredible bureaucracy. But the point is that it's not even getting to Taiwan, a lot of this stuff. And now, imagine in a conflict. So that's just one element of how shockingly stupid all of this can be. So tensions in the Taiwan Strait have escalated in the past year, with Chinese President Xi Jinping vowing to reunify the island with the mainland by force if necessary, and U.S. President Biden repeatedly hinting that Washington will intervene militarily if China invaded. Beijing broke off security and climate ties with the U.S. last August, after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi shrugged off warnings from Chinese officials and went through a visit to Taipei. Earlier this year, another Washington think tank, the Center for Strategic International Studies, ran 24 different war game scenarios for U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. The study found that the U.S. and Japan, you love that, right? That they're already marking out the alliances, that they would emerge victorious, but that they would lose dozens of warships, hundreds of planes, and thousands of troops. Taiwan will be left in ruins, while China would lose hundreds of ships and aircraft, as well as tens of thousands of troops, said the think tank. In light of the resupply problem, Gallagher said Washington must accelerate deliveries of the $19 billion in U.S. weaponry that Taiwan has ordered. He also called for more joint training exercises, reinforcement of U.S. military installations in the region, and increased missile production. The goal, of course, is to deter China from launching the invasion, Gallagher said on a Fox News interview before Wednesday's war game. One of the obvious lessons from the failure of deterrence in Ukraine is that when it breaks down, it's very costly in terms of blood and treasure and lives. So we are conducting this war game in order to prevent a war. So that doesn't sound like what a war game simulation is, preventing a war. Gallagher added that peace can only be achieved through strength, particularly since Xi Jinping appears to be preparing his country for war. I'm sure he'd prefer to have conquest without war. We need to be ready, but we're not moving fast enough. I mean, that's all just nonsense, because China has been clear that it's not about taking it by force. No, this isn't about taking the island by force. It's about reunifying after thousands of years of being part of China, facing decades upon decades of colonization, Dutch, Japan, and then facing numerous Taiwan Straits crises after 1949, which essentially was all about the U.S. trying to destroy China's newfound independence. New China, that's what they called it in 1949, to destroy it and to create another unsinkable aircraft carrier, as Japan called it during World War II. So that is really the agenda here. It is not about China invading. China's not going to invade Taiwan unless the United States crosses that red line. China will exercise its right to protect its sovereignty. And that is exactly what would happen, because that is fact. we often don't take into consideration how the United States is the one violating sovereignty here, not not China. China is not violating the sovereignty of Taiwan because Taiwan is not internationally recognized as a sovereign country. This is not hard to understand if you just read the documents, if you understand international law and you understand history. If you understand history, you understand that this has been law since 1971. And then finally, the US and China normalized in 1979. So for the US, it's essentially been law since 1979. And so if it's been law since 1979, why isn't it being followed? Well, because the United States from the beginning, through the Taiwan Relations Act, undermined the one China principle by saying, no, we can just arm Taiwan as much as we can because we still need to defend Taiwan from China. That's how the United States created a loophole, and that's how they began to develop the conditions, even as they try to normalize with China, even as they increase cooperation and economic investment within China. They left open the neocons, these foreign policy war hawks left open the possibility of waging war on China via Taiwan through that loophole. And they're exercising it now because the situation is getting dire, because they are running out of time. China is continuing to grow, to surpass the US in the West in all sorts of areas. Its leadership around the world is becoming unquestionable. And with all of that, with its unquestionable leadership comes this really huge threat to US hegemony. And so Taiwan is now on the order of the day. It is the proxy war that the United States wants to see jump off should the possibility arise. The problem with this is that, as the war games indicate, and these are not friendly war games, these are military industrial complex, neocon foreign policy establishment controlled think tanks. They are saying that everything is destroyed. Everything will be destroyed. They're not going so far as they will go nuclear, although I believe that any kind of conflict over Taiwan, should the U.S. cross the red line to the point of no return, would go immediately nuclear. And so all of this propaganda, as we've said many times on this channel, this propaganda, it's all made up. 2027, 2025. No, this is all just U.S. pontifications. China does not want to invade. China wants to reunify peacefully. China is going to observe these elections. If the KMT comes to power, China will work to solidify the one China principle between the mainland and between Taiwan. China wants robust economic relations with Taiwan. And indeed, Taiwan's economy is intimately connected to China, so much so that it is deeply reliant upon China. Taiwan is a semiconductor factory of the world. China is the semiconductor producer, high-tech producer, and of all the technology that semiconductors are used for. And it's increasingly becoming a semiconductor power itself. So these two areas of China, right, mainland and Taiwan, are complementary, and it makes absolutely no sense for them to be severed. And the economic crisis on Taiwan Island is only going to get worse as the United States begins to squeeze the entirety of the Asia Pacific technologically through this export ban. And I have an article coming out in CGTN very soon talking about South Korea and how South Korea is about to visit the president of South Korea, President Yoon. He's about to visit Joe Biden upon invitation, the second such state visit of any leader, the first being Macron. And Zelensky doesn't count because Zelensky wasn't formally invited, and he went to Congress on a jet, and it wasn't a state visit per se. They didn't want to call it that because of the conflict. But you could throw Zelensky in there as well if you consider him a legitimate leader. But Yoon is coming. He's coming between the 24th, which is tomorrow as of this recording, and he'll be there till the 30th. And he's coming with like 100 plus business delegates, but he's coming with his hands with his tail between his legs because of these leaked documents showing that South Korea was spied upon. South Korea's economy is in major contraction because of this U.S. tech war on China. This export ban on semiconductors has led to a massive decrease in South Korea's investment with China, which has sent the country in a tailspin trade deficit that it cannot ameliorate. That's why it's bringing all these business delegates like, please save us. But the United States is not going to save South Korea, just like it won't save Taiwan. So South Korea is in a really bad position, but this is the plan for Taiwan and South Korea and all of these countries that decide to choose the U.S. side over China rather than balance its portfolio or, join the multipolar express. If, and it's quite unlikely that South Korea or Japan would do anything but be a little more balanced, given that their governments are essentially vassals of the U.S. But their governments right now, especially South Korea, Taiwan, separatist authorities, Japan, all these governments that have decided to hitch their wagon on the U.S. side are already in a rude awakening and in for a ruder one the longer things go on. And so that's the future for Taiwan economically. But politically, there's about to be seismic changes because people in Taiwan really care about their economics, just like most people everywhere else in the world care about their economics. Not to mention the fact that most people still want the status quo, regardless of independence leanings or not, right? Most people want the status quo, which is one China. People just don't want war. And Tsai Ing-wen keeps threatening that. The DPP keeps threatening that by hitching its wagon to the U.S. side. So this is the situation. It's not going well for the United States. They keep predicting that there's going to be some kind of some kind of invasion from China. They are literally dreaming. That's not going to happen. There will be no invasion from China. What interest would China have to invade its own sovereign territory? What interest would it have to do that randomly? No, it would have to be provoked. And this is the red herring. This is where we should be alarmed, because this is the same kind of narrative they were using with Ukraine, that Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade. And all the while, for 7+ years, 8 years, the United States was fortifying Ukrainian military after a coup. So it staged a coup in Ukraine, fortified a military, propped up fascists and neo-Nazis and just regular Nazis and Azov and all these forces, fortified them, right? So it did all of that. And then in the lead up to February 2022 was intensifying the onslaught in the Donbass through its fortifications of Ukraine's military. So it was doing all of this, right? It was doing all of this while saying that it's Russia. It's Russia that's instigating. It's Russia that's instigating. No, it was not Russia that was instigating. It was the United States. It was NATO. And NATO was expanding along Russia's border for years before that, decades before that. So all this is to say is that the same playbook is being used against China. The U.S. has surrounded China with hundreds of military bases. John Pillager says it is up to 400. And that was in 2016. You know that the Philippines just came up with a new agreement for 4 more. So this encirclement campaign has already been happening. Every day, every other day, the U.S. is sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait. So you have something like 60% of the Navy, 50% of all of the U.S. military, hundreds of thousands of military personnel. You have a fully fortified militarization of the U.S. side in the Asia Pacific, all geared toward China. A lot of these installations geared up with nuclear weapons. And they're saying that it's China that's going to invade unprovoked. They said the same about Russia, unprovoked. But really, all of that with the added insult of diplomatic warfare, of claiming to be for one China, and then going to Taiwan or seeing Tsai Ing-wen in the United States, going to Taiwan and meeting with Tsai Ing-wen, these House leaders Pelosi and then McCarthy. All of this is just a major escalation in the nuclear direction, not the war direction, but it is a nuclear direction. That is the danger. That is the real threat. Not that China is going to invade, because I would bet the existence of this channel that China would not invade unless provoked. And that's the lesson of the Ukraine conflict. The Ukraine conflict was, we didn't believe Russia was going to invade because we believed the United States and NATO weren't going to escalate to the point that would necessitate it. But they did, and Russia did. Now, the same thing applies to China. China is being provoked over and over and over again. The one China principle is being trampled upon. Those comments by Qin Gang, you play with fire on Taiwan, you will get burned, that was directed to South Korea's President Yoon, because what did he say? He said that Taiwan was a global issue. No, it's not a global issue. It's not. It's not a global issue. It is China's internal affairs. That's what the UN says. And South Korea is literally just trying to pander to the US to curry favor and hopefully gain some benefits. But those benefits are going to be so far and few and far between. They're not that's the death sentence that the US has for Asia and the rest of the world. It is follow its dictates into the abyss of death. Scott Ritter said it on this channel. He said, everything the US touches dies. And that's what the United States is doing. It is not just touching, though. It's not just giving a light tap on the shoulder. No, it is throwing its war machine at the biggest rising powers in the world, the new leaders of the world, those countries that have proven themselves to be legitimate leaders around the world. Russia and China, especially China, it's throwing everything it has at them. And it is saying, let's go to war. That's what the U.S. is saying. And it's saying that ever so steadily, because it knows, the U.S. knows, the neocons know, the foreign policy establishment knows, that if it steps too far, if it goes too far, that it will lose. CNAS is saying, Center for New American Security, Center for National Strategic Studies are saying it, that no matter how victorious they may be on the battlefield, which I don't think it will get to that point, because it'll go nuclear. China and the U.S. are not going to fight a confrontational war without the use of nuclear weapons. Neither country would allow it. So with that said, the U.S. side is going to lose, because guess what? Everybody loses. So there is no victory in this war, but there are interests behind provoking this war. And that is to contain China and to try to undermine China, to try to conduct regime change on China. It's not going to work. It's a failed policy, but it's one that the U.S. is engaging in anyway. And that is the real danger that we need to be speaking up about. We need to be speaking out about. And we need to oppose all forces behind it, from the China hawkish Republicans to the indifferent and outright hawkish Democrats, to the EU and NATO leaders who are so complicit, if not absolutely indebted to this war and completely committed to it. We need to call all of them out. We need to unseat them. They need to not have power. We need to do what France is doing, get out in the streets and make sure that the leaders tremble, that these rulers tremble. That's what we need to be doing. And that's what all of this war planning and predictions should be telling us. It should be telling us we need to get prepared ourselves to fight a people's war for the things that we want, for peace, for self-determination, for prosperity for all, common prosperity, not just for oligarchs, but everyone prospering, everyone having what they need, and then working towards what they want. That is what we need to be focusing on, not Taiwan and Ukraine and these proxy wars And all of this is a waste of time, energy, and it literally is bringing the world to the brink of annihilation if the world is measured in humanity's existence and the existence of living things, because that's what a nuclear winter would surely bring an end to. So that should be the lesson here. That should be the message from all of this provocation around Taiwan.